Hello everyone, welcome to Point of Insanity Game Studio, Geekery in General. This is just a quick off-the-cuff episode which I decided to record because it is relevant to a recent announcement in the gaming industry. Now, I am not using my normal equipment to record this episode, so I apologize if the sound quality isn't quite as good, and also I do have my 3D printer running in the background. Now, I am recording this on July 31st, Friday, and yesterday my wife and I caught a video on YouTube from Gen Con where Wizards of the Coast announced it was bringing back some past campaign settings. So first they brought on Luke Gygax, the son of the late Gary Gygax, to talk about the return of Greyhawk. And I think that's cool. I never really got into the Greyhawk setting as a kid. I've got one module from it called Isle of the Ape, and I used to have one called Mordenkainen's Fantastic Adventure, but other than that, I've never really done much in Greyhawk. Most of the time when my friends and I were gaming, we either used the Forgotten Realms, Mystara, or we would make up our own settings, or not really using a specific setting at all. Though if I'm not mistaken, some of the early first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons modules that were not labeled for a certain setting were believed to have been taking place in Greyhawk, but I'm not entirely sure about that. So it is nice to see that they are bringing Luke in as a consultant, as Luke played an early character named Melf, and his name has appeared in several spells over the years. Unfortunately, after Gary Gygax left the company, TSR decided to downplay Greyhawk and essentially forgot about it. I started to try to read one of the books called The Price of Power, but I didn't really get into it. A friend of mine, though, says that unfortunately I picked the wrong book to start with, because apparently the older books featuring Gord the Rogue, which were written by Gary Gygax, are actually really good books, so I'll have to go check those out someday. They also announced that they're bringing Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman back in to work on a 5th edition version of Dragonlance. And that's cool too. I never really did much adventuring in the Dragonlance campaign setting, but I loved the stories. If you're going to ever take a recommendation from me on a book, I highly recommend Dragonlance Chronicles Part 1, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, and then the two following books, Dragons of Winter Night and Dragons of Spring Dawning. Very well written books. You know, there's certainly some very memorable characters in there, but one of the things I liked about these books is not only were they good adventure stories, they had a touch of humor in there as well. And this is one of the things I liked about Weiss and Hickman's writing style, is that they knew exactly when to put in comic relief and how much to use. It was never overdone. You know, they weren't trying to go for constant, laughs and chuckles. So, like I said, Dragons of Autumn Twilight, very good book, and I certainly recommend the other Dragonlance novels as well. But what surprised me is they announced the return of Dark Sun. I used to have the Dark Sun box set, and I had one of the game books for it. I've played a couple games in Dark Sun, but it's not really a campaign setting that my friends and I ever really explored very much. It did surprise me, and I'll get to the reason why in a moment. Now, I will have to say that Dark Sun is probably one of the most original campaign settings they ever did, especially for the time. Dark Sun is usually described as post-apocalypse D&D, Or some people would say imagine a Mad Max Dungeons and Dragons crossover, but without the guns and the cars. So the entire system was designed to be very savage, very brutal. And you could see this in the style of the art that they used, specifically Gerald Brom. I would probably compare it to the old Golden Axe arcade games. So if any of you have ever played those games, the artistic style has always reminded me of Dark Sun. Or rather, Dark Sun always reminded me of Golden Axe. During the speech, the guy who did the introduction mentioned that it's going to be sold shrink-wrapped because apparently this is going to be rated M for mature. And the guy said something to the effect of how our lawyers told us we're going to have to shrink-wrap this, and apparently it's going to contain nudity and sexual situations. Also, they had a promotional animation for it, which was, like I said, just brutal. People being torn apart and blood and guts and lots of gore. Now, that kind of stuff doesn't offend me, okay? And I am glad to see Dark Sun coming back because it was a very unique setting. Now, since over the last few years, as I mentioned in my last episode about the problematic aspects of D&D, I was surprised that they are bringing it back and they are going for this more brutal, rated M for mature approach. Because everything in Dark Sun was different. Some of the classes were taken out. Like, for example, there were no paladins. The nature of the Dark Sun campaign setting was such that the importance of survival left very little room for chivalry. There was a new warrior class introduced called the Gladiator. They also did some different things with the clerics, druids, and magic users. First, with clerics, there's no gods on Athos. Instead, you are a cleric of one of the elements. And this was an interesting change because it determined what types of weapons and armor you could wear. Like, for example, I like air clerics. I don't remember what type of armor they could wear, but they could only use weapons that were either thrown, like a spear or an axe, or they had to rely on missile weapons like bows and slings, and I don't know if there were crossbows in Dark Sun. It's been a while, so I'm going entirely off of memory here. Another example, if you were a water cleric, you could only use weapons and armor made from things that were once alive, like leather and bone and wood. And it's also worth noting that metal was very scarce on Athos, so most of your weapons and equipment are going to be made of wood, leather, bone, stone, obsidian, and also the carapace of giant insect creatures. The other type of cleric was a Templar. The world of Athos has various city-states that are ruled by sorcerer kings. And as a Templar, you're basically a priest of one of these kings. Magic users were different because, first of all, arcane magic is distrusted on this world, and I'll explain why in a moment here. But there were two types of wizards. First were preservers. Preservers functioned very much like your common mage or wizard in most D&D settings. If my memory serves me correctly, whenever you cast spells in this game world, there's a give and take between you and the land. And as a preserver, you learn how to balance that give and take. The other type of wizard, the Defiler, said, screw that. And they took shortcuts, so they actually advanced faster. I believe they were restricted in what alignments they could choose, but the main thing is, whenever they cast a spell, it turned a certain amount of land around them into sterile ash. And the more powerful the spell, the more land that you affected with your magic. Psionics, or psychic powers, also played a very important role in this setting. All characters had at least one psychic power, and many of the monsters that you would meet also had psychic powers as well. The races were a bit different. There were humans, there were also elves, but elves were very nomadic, and they tended to be portrayed as thieves and tricksters. So most people didn't trust elves. There were also half-elves who usually were viewed with mistrust and suspicion. They do have dwarves in Dark Sun, but unlike the standard fantasy dwarf, they're hairless. Now, there was also another race. It's spelled M-U-L. I don't know if they pronounced it Mule or Mull, but this race is a half-breed of a human and a dwarf. And they were said to be very difficult to carry the term, and this is where I could see some controversy if they keep this part in, but mules were generally bred for either slavery or for gladiatorial combat, because in the Dark Sun campaign setting, slavery was very commonplace. And again, if I'm not mistaken, the introductory adventure that came with the box set involved being escaped slaves. And I know that when I was a member of RPGA, I did run a Dark Sun RPGA event game that they published that also involved being slaves that were escaping from their masters. You also had half giants, and later these would become Goliaths in later versions of the game. There were also 3 Kreen and halflings. But halflings were very savage and were cannibalistic. As I recall in one of the descriptions, they were somewhat superstitious, so they would often adapt their armor and weapons to these superstitions. Like, for example, if you were going to travel through a land inhabited by elves, you might take a dagger with you made of, the bone of an elf. Yeah, like I said, Dark Sun was not for the faint of heart. So why is this world mostly desert wasteland? Why is it a post-apocalyptic setting? Well, that has to do because of past actions in the game world's history where powerful and corrupt wizards essentially destroyed the environment in the quest for power. Again, I might be wrong on that. It's been a while since I've read the books. One of the other interesting facets of this game is that if you were playing a preserver or a defiler, once you got to a certain level, you could become either a dragon king if you were a defiler, or if you were a preserver, you could become another type of creature. I don't remember the name, but essentially each step, it was a long process where you had to go from level 21 to level 30, and each step you had to perform certain actions. And usually with if you wanted to become a dragon king because you were a defiler, it involved sacrificing people and doing other unsavory things. And I think if you wanted to become, if you were a preserver, you had to do a lot of acts of good and compassion. But if you went through all the steps, as a defiler, you eventually became a dragon king, where it started out you got a little taller and you started to take on more reptilian features, and then eventually you became a dragon. Whereas with the preserver, you started to become this intangible being of pure light. So definitely very interesting concepts. Now, as I said, though, it did surprise me because of how brutal this setting is and how they are taking this very mature approach. I'm almost wondering if they're doing this as a way to try to bring back some of the older gamers who aren't happy with the style and presentation of 5th edition, or if they're trying to draw in some of the edgelord gamers who prefer darker and more grim settings. That's just a thought on my part. I was kind of shocked when I read that they were taking this more brutal approach, because back in the original version of Dark Sun, yeah, it was very savage and primitive art, but at least the stuff I saw, nothing was exceptionally gory or bloody or, exceptionally offensive. So in any case, it should be interesting to see how they adapt version 5.5 to the Dark Sun setting, especially in light of all the controversies over the last few years about, problematic aspects of D&D. So I wonder if they are going to keep the half-elves and the moles in there, since they did get rid of half-elves and half-orcs in mainline D&D, and also how they're going to address the slavery issue. But that's a topic for another day, so it should be interesting to see how it turns out. This was just a very off-the-cuff, impromptu episode, so I apologize if I got a little bit rambly, but like I said, we'll see what happens, and if any of you are at Gen Con right now, or if you are listening to this after getting back from Gen Con, hope you had a wonderful time.